Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Nico Nurmi. I'm an executive advisor here at Procurement Leaders, and I'm your host for today's webinar that we have partnered on with HICX. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. What we'll be focusing on today is really very centric around suppliers and supplier centricity and supplier experience, really, which is, I guess, something that a lot of companies have in the last couple of years, I guess, really come to realize a pretty darn important thing and something that we should really collectively put a bit more emphasis on. And as a result, we're here today to discuss topics like what it means to adopt this, supplier experience approach and how to make it easier for suppliers to interact with our procurement systems. So these are all very exciting and important topics, and I'm really thrilled to have two experts here to discuss these topics with me today. So on the panel today, we have Carmen Earhart, who is the Head of Global Processes and Operations and Digitalization at Henkel. And then we have Anthony Payne, who is the Chief Marketing Officer at HICX. I think, before we go into the conversation, it would be nice to just get introductions from both of you. So, Carmen, could you just start by giving a brief introduction to yourself and your role at Henkel, please?
Yes, Nico, happy to do so. Yeah, hello, everybody, and also welcome from my side. Very happy to be here today. As said, my name is Carmen Earhart. I'm heading on the purchasing side at Henkel on a global scale, digitalization, processes, and operations. And with that, I hand over to Anthony.
Great, thanks, Carmen. Thanks, Nico, and hi, everybody. Thanks for your time. So my name's Anthony Payne. As Nico said, I look after the marketing function at HICX. Today's webinar is absolutely not about HICX, so I'm not going to go into any kind of sort of description there other than to say that our mission is to help very large organizations take control of supplier data and to deliver a great supplier experience to every one of their suppliers. And so my role is as the marketing function, helping to tell that story, and I'm working with practitioners around the world towards those goals. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both. Really thrilled to have you here. Before we dive into the conversation, just a couple of points around, well, I guess the housekeeping, the exciting part that everyone wants to hear about. But on the platform here where you're logged in, you can see the Q&A and help icons there. So if you have any problems at any point of the webinar or any technical issues, please use the help icon, obviously. And then similarly, the Q&A icon is there just for you to post questions to our panel. So I really encourage you to post questions throughout the webinar. So at any point, we'll make sure to reserve some time for the questions at the end. We've also included a couple interesting online resources there too for your viewing. So I'd just like to highlight the Scarcity Economy report that we've recently published, which really looks into how organizations with shortages of talent and shortages of supply. So very topical piece of research there. And there's also a link to an upcoming webinar that we have on Procurement Leaders on the topic of sustainability. But yeah, those were all the points that I wanted to highlight before we dive into the conversation. And these will really be the discussion points today. And I think let's dive straight into the first point here. So what it really means to adopt this kind of supplier experience approach. And Anthony, I'm going to start off with you because this supplier experience or supplier experience management are essentially two terms that we're hearing more and more often these days. And would you like to kick things off by really explaining what that really means and what's your kind of definition for these two terms?
Yeah, sure. No, happy to. It's been exciting over the last sort of few months to see these terms start to pick up. We're really pleased to see it. And I think there's sort of two parts, I think, to the answer to this. One is maybe a little bit theoretical, and then we'll look at a little bit sort of practical. On the theoretical side, I do think that what we're talking about is almost, without wishing to sound pretentious, almost a philosophical change or something of a movement. And it's about how organizations need to recognize that in this very uncertain and dynamic world that we're now in, where resilience is arguably as important as efficiency when we're thinking about our supply chain and our procurement. In that kind of environment, we have to recognize it's no longer a zero-sum game between buying organizations and supply organizations and their suppliers, right? It's not the case that for a buyer to win in a price negotiation or whatever, the supplier must lose. And we're actually seeing that leading organizations are recognizing this. Now, it's not happening. That's not something that's only happened in the last few weeks or few months, but it's definitely something that's accelerated over the last couple of years when organizations were relying on suppliers in unusual and extreme circumstances. And I think what's happening is organizations are recognizing that their supply chain is actually an extension of their own operation. And so in the same way as companies treat their employees well and with respect and with some understanding of what it is motivates employees, so too they're starting to think about their suppliers. Suppliers have their own business goals, their own objectives, their own purpose. And it's adopting that sort of supplier-centric mindset. Now, this will be a theme we come back to probably. I'm not suggesting that suddenly we throw all of our commercial principles out the window and now we work for our suppliers. Clearly, that's not true. It's not a wholesale shift from one side to the other, but it is a movement. So that, I think, is a theoretical. If we think about something a little bit more practical, if that was a little bit soft and abstract for people, then to me what supplier experience management is about is removing friction. And it's removing friction, I think, from every aspect of the relationship with every supplier, 100% of your suppliers. So, we've done a great job over the years of working very closely and very collaboratively with our very largest and most strategic suppliers. But I think SXM, or supplier experience management, is about thinking about friction across the board, even down into what we sometimes call our tail spend suppliers. Why? Why do we care? Why should we even think about this? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think there is an opportunity to actively reduce your supplier's cost to serve you, which should in turn have a benefit when it comes to price negotiations and discussions. You're adding cost into your suppliers when you make life more difficult for them in terms of accessing data or providing you information. So reducing cost to serve, I think, is important. I think there's an opportunity to very significantly improve control and visibility. So, and when I talk about that, I'm thinking, in the end, your suppliers own the data, right? You don't really own that data. They have the information. They have the latest data, and you're relying on suppliers to share that with you, whether it's their name and address and their tax ID, or it's their certification and sort of compliance information. So if you can remove friction and encourage and your suppliers to share that data with you, and that such they want to, then that will have a very clear knock-on effect in terms of control and visibility. And then I think the other thing is, the other sort of area of benefit from adopting this mindset is increasing the chances that you position your company as customer of choice for as many of your suppliers as possible. Customer of choice is one of my favorite terms, but I think we actively think about how do we get to the front of the queue with as many suppliers as possible. It's really important. And the last quick point, just before I stop, is, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but this could be as simple as dynamically customizing your onboarding form, so you only ask the questions that the suppliers need to answer. Right? We're so accustomed to a spreadsheet with 17 tabs and 1,000 questions, and suppliers having to sort of go through the whole lot, whereas in fact there's only 11 questions that matter to them, or a subset. So removing friction is just making it easier, customizing for them, or providing invoice payment status visibility. It's a hot topic and one that I know many organizations struggle with, but they have a massive impact on suppliers. Or even just, putting the phone number for supplier inquiries on all of your correspondence. It's just, these are sort of little things, and we'll talk more in detail. So as I say, I think this philosophy, or this sort of movement, but it is also very practical. You will get benefit if you enable your suppliers to serve you better. And maybe that was a bit longer than I intended, but hopefully that makes sense, and it's kind of how I think about it.
No, thanks very much, Anthony, for that. And definitely a couple of keywords there that I think certainly keep, coming up in my conversations with procurement leaders, members as well. And I think one interesting point especially, and perhaps we'll discuss this in the later sections as well, but really just that suppliers owning their data. I know that's been a massive headache for some companies, just overall getting that visibility and transparency about the different aspects of the supplier landscape. So definitely anything that can be done to improve that is a massive game changer. Carmen, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well from Henkel's perspective. Are you seeing this trend kind of impacting the industry, and would you say from your perspective that there really is this drive towards more supplier centricity? And I guess just what does it actually look like in practice from your viewpoint?
I believe there's definitely the trend to that one, and there's also the urgent need for that one. We are more and more in a seller market. I mean, Henkel is a big company where you might thought you might have impact on certain suppliers. But as a matter of fact, even for us as a big company, we face seller markets. We see that a supplier are not keen to re-enter their data again and again. And you also need to consider speed. How much time do you have to get the data from supplier? Can you really afford to chase the supplier again and again for data, or is there a simple way, to make that happen? And if you have if you offer a good experience for the supplier, the benefit is for you. You're gonna get the data quicker and faster. And this is, I mean, speed counts nowadays when you look at a volatile market environment. So definitely, other than that, I think everything has been said already, but just want to add the factor of speed and just that you really get it at the end. That is really crucial. And this is where the benefit for us as a company is in.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I kind of just want to move us on to other points here on the agenda, but really looking at the difference between, well, I guess like segmentation overall. So if you are trying to, I guess, improve the supplier experience, are you looking to do that kind of to the whole supply base or just focusing on some of them? So really maybe thinking about the difference between, your supplier segmentation models overall and then kind of personalization as it relates to suppliers. So I guess overall where I'm kind of going with this is that there's nothing really, I guess, new about segmentation when it comes to procurement. That's a core procurement activity, but there's more nuance, and procurement organizations are overall putting much more emphasis and attention on segmentation. So maybe Anthony, just your thoughts on how perhaps better supplier segmentation can improve the supplier experience and, well, overall kind of supplier experience management.
Yeah, definitely. I love this subject, as I'm talking offline with Carmen as well. And that may be because I'm a marketer, and quite honestly, segmentation is sort of page one of the marketing textbook. If you learn nothing else in marketing, then learn segmentation. But I think also segmentation is actually core to what most people do in most functions across the business every day. We might do it to different levels of functionality, of formality or sophistication, but we're always making trade-offs and decisions about where we invest our time based on the audience or the stakeholders we're working with. So, for me, I think of segmentation is two things. One is it's a question of resource allocation. And then the other is what you might call experiential. And if you sort of bear with me for a second, let me just sort of talk about those for a moment. I think if we think about resource allocation, what we're essentially doing is breaking our audience down into small groups to prioritize time and money and how much we're going to invest in those for a desired outcome. And on the sales and marketing side of the businesses we work for, this is an absolute given. As consumers, we understand that the brand selling to us will segment us based on how much money they think we're going to spend with them, right? And that's true of Vodafone, and it's segmenting customers into their high spends or low spends. It's true in B2B environments, right? We segment based on where we think the best outcome is going to come from. We also segment from an employee perspective. We like it a lot. A lot of the companies on this call, I'm sure, have sort of top talent acceleration programs, those that they think of the sort of potential leadership of tomorrow. It doesn't mean we don't, we treat everybody else poorly, but we do segment, and companies do spend more time on sort of training the top talent. It's just a reality. And it's obviously true from a supplier perspective as well, right? And, you don't need me, a non-procurement practitioner, to tell you, how procurement thinks about segmentation. Has been doing this for years in order to identify the strategies to deploy. And there's obviously a model that I'm sure actually everyone on the call is familiar with, four-blocker model that segments based on the risk of supply failing in a particular category or a particular product, and also the importance of that product and the ease of replacing it. So that's a model that's very well understood. But what I think, even when we're thinking about sort of resource allocation segmentation, it's now the case that even a supplier you think of as tail spend, or as not strategic, or as supplying something that's essentially a commodity, they can represent very significant risk to your brand. If they're breaking rules, if they're using child labor, if they're in breach of certain regulations, then that can have financial implications for you as an organization, but also have brand and reputational or PR implications as well. And we're all familiar with horror stories. But they can also represent an opportunity, right? Those small suppliers could be where new innovation can come from, right? And so, or it could be how you achieve the next step in a particular, sort of compliance initiative that you're following. So all of this, I've gone on a bit, but it is around, how do you allocate resources to get the outcomes you want? The experiential, which I know we'll probably talk about in a bit more, is I want to separate from that, right? Segmentation is about, resource allocation is about how do we put money and time and resources to get our goals. If you can also use segmentation, though, to think about from the supplier side, or customer, employee, whichever, but from the supplier side, what's the experience they're going to have? And how do we as an organization deliver them an experience that is based on their characteristics? And I think that's much newer, and I know that organizations like Henkel are starting to think about this without putting words in Carmen's mouth, but we know people like Unilever, Mondelez, Mars, for example, are thinking about it as well. I'm sure we'll come back to it, but I wanted to start by just sort of separating these two, segmenting because of resource allocation and then segmenting for experience. So, hopefully that makes sense, but that's our starting point.
It does make sense, and actually I want to drill down a bit deeper into this, because on that experiential side, what would you say, or like, why do you kind of see this as such a big opportunity for procurement, or what are you really, I guess, overall kind of like recommendations on what the organization should be looking into when they try and put more of an experiential layer on supplier segmentation? So, but I guess question back to you, Anthony, before we hear Carmen's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, no, obviously I'd love to hear Carmen's views as well, but I do think it's a big opportunity, and I think that the reason it comes back to some of those benefits I alluded to earlier, which is the broader reason to do supplier experience management, right? If you favorable supply in times of constraint, efficiency, etc. We don't need to rehash those, but I do think there's an opportunity, and the key is to separate these two things: it's resource allocation and experiential. I think if you think about the resource allocation, there's only so many segments you can manage, right? We used to say 4, maybe it's 6 or 8 or 12, but you're not going to have thousands of segments that you build strategies around across your supplier base. It's not practical. But on the experiential side, you can and you are. Like you could be thinking about what people in marketing talk about as hyper segmentation, which is really down to segments of one and individuals, right? And now this sounds a bit maybe terrifying from a procurement perspective, but I think the way to think about it is go across the hall and go speak to the marketing teams in your organizations, understand how they do it, because they cheat. Right now, let me explain why a little bit. So we're all familiar as consumers with, receiving a personalized email from a brand, let's take Apple or whatever. Nobody in Cupertino knows who Anthony Payne is, who lives in Wiltshire and knows everything about me. They have no idea who I am, right? But through the cleverness of computers, through digital, I get a highly personalized email, which is based on what they know about me from previous purchases, based on my advertising behavior in scarily real time, to customize a message and an offer to me. So I become a segment of one, right? But it's not because there's an account manager at Apple who cares who I am, but it's because of the technology. And I think this technology, the availability of this technology, is now. And I think procurement leaders can start to think about, how is it we can offer to suppliers an experience when they log onto the portal, they get their chosen language, they get their preferred currency, they get compliance and risk information that's only relevant to them. They get access to transactional information, order status, payment status, forecast information, whatever it is, at a click of a button. Even though behind the scenes, you as an organization, you've still got 17 ERPs, 2 P2P suites, and an ever-growing list of best-of-breed technology which you're investing in. So all that complexity still exists, but there's no reason using digital tooling that we can't shield that so that the supplier feels they've tailored this just for me so that I can work with them really well. And that's what I'm quite excited about. You can hear from my voice about how do you deliver a great one-to-one experience. And I do want to separate it from the resource allocation point and think more about as I say, this experiential view. Maybe I'm a marketer who just drinks my own Kool-Aid, but that's the stuff that's getting me excited. Hopefully.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anthony. If only we also had means to just collect the same amounts of data, so kind of conveniently as marketers do on the consumer space, really. No, but that's all really exciting and definitely, I guess, an interesting direction where procurement is going. So really excited about the future there and how, I guess, the emergence of better data and cleansing all of that data can help with with the supplier experience. But turning over to Carmen, just what are your thoughts on just overall, your kind of approaching segmentation overall? Are there any, I guess, specific drivers currently, for example, that might be changing your thinking around supplier segmentation, or anything else that kind of relates to what Anthony kind of described there previously?
Yeah, first of all, I share the dream and vision with Anthony to have a one-stop shop for our suppliers. I mean, that's the ultimate target. And as soon as you say that, there comes the complexity with it, because also on supplier end, there is not only one person behind the supplier, there is the AP clerk, and there is the key account manager, the salesperson, whatever roles you have there. And the segmentation, I mean, there are different aspects you could look at when you segment your suppliers. So one could be you do it role-based, and you basically coming back to the resource topic, which was brought up already by Anthony. You could say, let's take that role, which causes the most effort on my end. Maybe that's the AP clerk, yeah, causing a lot of tickets nowadays because he wants to know his invoice status, so more going into the daily transactional part. Or is it more the certificate management, audit related, whatever? Or is it really updating usual master data? That could be one way of segmentation. I also believe that still a direct supplier for us is having different requirements than an indirect material supplier. So actually there are kind of different ways to look at the segmentation. Probably just simply segmenting in big and small suppliers, that's too blunt, and I wouldn't, probably that's not the way to go to. I think it's very inspiring what has been just shared with us. Definitely something we need to think about. We are in a very early stage and didn't come yet to conclusions, but from what we experienced so far, probably there's a journey, and you probably need to start with, once you have made up your mind on the segmentation, you probably need to start with one segment and and kick it off from there.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. Have you had, I guess, deeper conversations with any strategic suppliers, for example, or have you really, I guess, looked into collecting data about your suppliers, or just asking about their thoughts on what might be not I guess, going perfectly in the supplier management process overall? Like, where are you kind of at currently in that process, in that journey?
We do have already a kind of supplier portal in place, but is it fully used? No. I would say a good third is using it on a regular base, and it's using it only for a couple of use cases. Also, coming back to the topic of data, what we see is that tomorrow we need more data from our suppliers than we used to need from them yesterday. Yeah, thinking of all the sustainability data, there are new use cases popping up every day. So our current portal will not be sufficient on that one. So we definitely need to move on. We also see that we spend a lot of resources in communicating with our suppliers, and if we are in some cases we have a ticketing tool, but that is also offline from the supplier portal. And the other side, we have tremendous email communication, which then also is somehow not linked to the data of the supplier. So you miss a lot of communication going on. Now probably that's going a little bit broader than your question was originally, but it's also kind of a use case. Yeah, we want to cover in the future of the supplier portal.
No, absolutely. important points. Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Sorry to speak over you, just to cut in, because the reason I get quite animated at this, because there are so many parallels with how organizations have worked with customers over the years, right? And in a past life, I worked in tech to support small to medium-sized retailers, and they have the same challenge. Like, you know, the customer support inquiry could be shared on social media, or it could come in via email or phone call. And the requirement to link all of those so that when they reply to the customer, they do so in a consistent way. So these problems are not easy. And on the customer-facing side, because it's revenue generating, the technology is definitely further ahead. But it's really gratifying it sounds weird to say it, but gratifying to hear these challenges common, because I do think there's a kind of blueprint, or at least a parallel to look at. And that's what I was sort of trying to convey is, you know, there are steps we don't have to invent everything. We can look at how our customer-facing colleagues work to standardize. Anyway, so I think it's really exciting, but we are, as an industry, behind where our revenue-facing counterparts are, probably not surprisingly.
Yeah, I would say that's probably quite a fair assessment there. And really, it just comes down to connecting the dots really there. I think when it comes to connecting those dots, obviously there's a technological aspect to that, and there's definitely ways in which kind of tech solutions can help with that. But also, if you just want to simplify things even more, it's just a matter of creating, I don't know, processes internally within procurement, have different category managers, for example, share best practices on what kind of measures they've gone to improve the supplier experience, and then what kind of benefits they have kind of gained from that. So just a couple of thoughts around that. But actually, Anthony, I want to just continue with you, because we have now talked a fair bit about the theory of segmentation and how that applies to suppliers, but just want to, again, dive a bit deeper into how do we actually do this, I guess, in practice, because it might be a bit difficult even to think about where do you start if you have been in the past kind of treating suppliers with this a bit more kind of single and kind of one size fits all experience kind of an approach that you have kind of alluded to there. So how would you kind of approach adopting this more supplier-centric view in just kind of practical terms?
Yeah, so as a employee of a technology vendor, it's easy to reach for that as the answer. So I'll resist the temptation. I think I'll start somewhere else, which is, I think quite obvious, but is just try to put yourself in the supplier's shoes, right? Actually see what it's like from a supplier's perspective to engage with you as an organization. You know, and to do so across the range of your suppliers as well. We probably have a fairly good idea of how our top strategic suppliers engage with us, because they have a one-to-one connection to an account manager or a supplier manager, right? So it's maybe not so surprising, but let's go deeper into your supply base. What is it actually like to onboard, to try and find out whether you've been paid, to access forecast information, try different personas on your supplier side. Common raised a really good point. When we talk about a supplier is not one thing. A supplier is a collection of people with different roles and objectives. So try to think about how that AP person is chasing up the invoice, or AR person is chasing up the invoice, or the account manager is trying to get information about a future bid. So put yourself in their shoes, I think, is how I think about it. And we might not like what we see. But I think, recognition that there's a challenge is always the first place in starting to fix it. And the other sort of element to that is recognizing, and again, Carmen raises was a really cool point, even for an organization the size and magnitude of Henkel, the suppliers might not always view you as their number one, right? You may be their number one customer, but you may not even be in their top five. You might be peripheral to them. And their day-to-day is not dominated by working for you necessarily. And so think about that from a usability and an experience perspective. If they just dip in to a process, is it really easy to adopt? Is it really easy to find it out without having to read a training manual or what have you? So I'd start there. Just see what your suppliers actually experience and then look for the relatively easy wins. That would be my initial thought.
Sounds very logical. Carmen, have you put any thought into this, or in practice looked at any kind of projects or initiatives that relate to what Anthony has just shared?
Yeah, I need to go back one step. If I look at our current experience or our current supplier experience, I must admit, if I put myself in the shoes of the suppliers at Henkel, he probably would be faced with 3 different portals. Yeah, if you think about your supplier life cycle, which you have, you basically first of all do a tender with your supplier, then you go for the supplier, you award him the supplier, then he needs to be onboarded probably, then you go into his daily operations, ordering and invoicing, and then it's this entire supplier lifecycle management, which is certificate management, audit requirements, where he regularly needs to upload documents. So it's not only that we have different roles also on the different suppliers, we also from our end have different portals. So it's a super huge complexity. And what I think is interesting in that context as well is start measuring what you basically demand from your suppliers. I just recently heard an interesting podcast where basically one metric would be that you count the clicks. How many clicks does the supplier need to do business with you? Honestly, I wouldn't want to count that currently, simply as that the number of portals throughout a supplier lifecycle management is already kind of and I think this is what we need to start measuring. How cool you are as a customer for them. Yeah, we are not always the first choice. We are for a lot of materials, we are in the seller market. So there is definitely a business case behind that one as well.
Excuse me, yeah, counting the clicks, that's, I think, quite an interesting proposal there. Probably might also lead to some not so flattering figures when you dive deeper into this. Anthony, have you looked at what the kind of experience might look like, today for suppliers, kind of in line with what Carmen there just mentioned, and what kind of changes we would want to make? I guess that's a bit of an extension to what you already described. But what would you, I guess, in just layman's terms, recommend what those key changes that people should make to their supplier kind of journey, and how do you kind of also know if it really is working, the changes that you have kind of made? If that makes any sense, that question.
I get it. I'm going to kind of duck the first part though, on the basis that I don't know what's needed, but because you kind of need to know what the supplier experience is. But I think the point about what good looks like, or how do we measure this, is important. And again, I'd start what I think is quite logical, which is go ask your suppliers for feedback. So part one is to put yourself in their shoes and go through the experience. Then our second part is go ask them directly for feedback. Yeah, we might not like what we hear. And I, by the way, as a vendor here, I don't want to be beating up organizations, large procurement organizations who are obviously doing incredibly well. Otherwise, the businesses they work for wouldn't be so successful. All I'm saying is that the last few years has seen a shift, and we're in the middle of that, and it's fun. So I'm not being critical. But anyway, so start by asking them for feedback. We might not like what we hear, but if we care about it, then we should take that on as feedback, and set benchmarks from that point. And it might be a series of one-to-one interviews through the supply chain, not just your strategics. There's obviously you can survey and ask for feedback. I think the other way to think about this might be performance management. Now, we think of performance management as being what we do to suppliers, right? Or ask of suppliers, whether it's on time in full or performance against some other SLAs or risk or compliance or what have you. But how many organizations measure their own performance as it relates to what their suppliers care about? And again, as I said at the start, I'm not saying we turn the tables, and Carmen used this term in a pre-call. We're not going to become a charity for our suppliers, right? Obviously, we're here to deliver value to the stakeholders and shareholders of Henkel or whomever. But equally, if we hold ourselves accountable against the performance measures that suppliers care about, then I think you can have more of a meaningful impact. So do we know, and I don't know anyone yet doing this, but do we know what our invoice payment rate is? Do we know, do we have any measure of what it is that suppliers the average cost to serve? Do we measure how well we respond to inquiries? Do we have service levels of an inquiry from a supplier? We ask this of our suppliers to us, and quite legitimately. But maybe we should think about how we measure performance to the suppliers based on what they want from us. I think it's an area of interest to explore, and I'm not some evangelical hippie that says we should all give up and work for our suppliers. But I think there's a shift that we can make, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carmen, any thoughts on that? I guess more on the kind of measuring side. So you mentioned that counting the clicks and so on, but what's your kind of journey in the future and like the plans that you have in place for, I guess, better supplier management and perhaps from measurement perspective at Henkel?
I would really start with measuring the platforms and channels I approach the supplier with. So it's not, I mean, we also use a lot of functional email addresses, yeah. And I'm often also being asked, is that a fraud or is that real coming from you guys? Also in that context, I think the supplier portal gives us certain security that at least there's a central place and you have one login where you basically can get in communication with Henkel. So it should be a safe place there as well. That's another reason going for that solution. So counting platform, counting channels would be for me another measurement. Also, how long does it take an average in days to onboard, to run a tender, to whatever you do, yeah? Of course, it also takes time to check back things on both sides, but that one can be measured still, and you can still kind of set targets that you want to go down in the averages. Clicks, I still believe, is a good one. And I think that was mentioned by Anthony very earlier, how many questions do we really ask? And might there be double questions throughout the lifecycle management? If you really go through it end to end, probably from a supplier's perspective, you think, you did ask me that before. Why do you come again with it? Because we very often, and I think also there, this end-to-end supplier portal would help. It shows you where you have inconsistencies in your process, where do you have double efforts and readdressing the same thing and again. So another level for efficiency on both sides, I believe.
Just on that one, I think, that sort of redundant requests is just a classic, it's caused by this. These are large organizations, and no individual in their job thinks, I don't care if we've asked the supplier this before, I'm just going to ask them again. No one thinks like that, right? It's just, we grow over time, we add processes, we add initiatives, and we each have, different parts of the business have their connections and their routes of communication to the supplier, and the technology doesn't really serve them to know, actually, we collected these 10 things already, you can just, no individual is deliberately being unpleasant to the supplier. It's a systemic problem I think we have to challenge. Technology is an enabler, but it's a systemic problem. So it's inadvertently causing this pain. It's not deliberate. I hope. I'm assuming in very few organizations is it deliberate.
Well, I certainly hope it's not indeed. But that, I guess, moves us on to just maybe look at technology in a bit more detail there, and maybe just your thoughts here, Carmen. What do you kind of see as the role that technology or technology vendors to that end kind of need to play in this? So what are your, I guess, requests for technology vendors, and what can really make your life easier as a procurement professional?
I come more from what I said on technology. I don't care so much on the detailed technology behind. What I want to see is my benefits, and what I expect as a benefit from the technology is that I do have touchless transactional processes with no manual interaction, best case, integrated communication with the supplier, which can also be somehow archived, a kind of on my end, because if you have a supplier portal, you of course look at the other side of the mirror, and you also want to see it, whatever you have exchanged with, you want to see the same set of data. And data, I think, is the thing for the future. You want to have one set of data, no inconsistency, no double entries of data, no missing data. So data is really the key word on that one, and that is what I would expect from the technology moving forward. I also believe once we are there, then you can work with the data and you can move direction of artificial intelligence. Yeah, also coming away from a reactive mode to a predictive, proactive mode. Do I see changing patterns with my suppliers? Is that normal, or is that a watch out for me? How does weather impact, I don't know, the collaboration with my supplier moving forward? Just mentioning a couple of examples we're looking at. And that may then also be coming back to the question of Vinicio. What is the benefit of it? I think it's probably difficult to really nail that down to, if you do that today, you're going to have that benefit to tomorrow. But I believe if you don't do it, you will have tremendous cost in the future in gathering data, trying to archiving them, manual catching them, and yeah, you will miss a lot of opportunities, I believe.
Yeah, the good old cost of not doing something there. But that actually, glad that you pointed out that one question that came from the audience there already, from one attendee here. Just keep sending any questions that you have. We're kind of moving towards the Q&A here, but maybe just wanted to get Anthony's views on this as well, and just to kind of reiterate the question here is that the benefits of adopting a supplier experience approach are clear. However, what are some hard cost savings formulas or methodologies companies could assess to justify a kind of return on investment for these initiatives? So, and would you care to lend your wisdom here for this question?
I don't know about wisdom, but I have a crack. Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and it's one that every buyer of tech should ask, right? I think it's certainly the case. The challenge is certainly the case that there's no line item on the P&L that says, supplier experience, and by doing X you increase the income or reduce the outgoings. Clearly, but there are some direct savings, I think, to be had, and direct impact, and then there's some indirect areas to explore. So on the direct side, I think you've got, Carmen alluded to this when talking about how long it takes to onboard. I don't want this to be about HICX, but there are customers of ours who can point to very direct savings as a consequence of shortening the supplier onboarding process from weeks, if not months, down to a matter of days, because as well as shortening the time, you reduce the number of people involved, you reduce the number of loops and feedback loops and cycles. And so there's a very hard cost saving in headcount equivalents for taking out the number of people who have to be involved, or reallocating the number of people that have to be involved in supplier onboarding. Another great example is, how many times do you take calls into your AP department on invoice payment status, right? A lot, every day, right? And so there's an opportunity there just to reduce those calls. Suppliers want to self-serve in most cases, right? Some people like to chat on the phone. Most people just want to get an answer. And if you make that nice and easy, there is a sort of help desk cost saving. And so I think you can look across the business at those kind of process efficiencies through a combination of self-service, accurate data, and improved and automated workflows to remove people from the process. So there are some hard savings. I think it's also that there's an indirect opportunity as well. And Carmen talked about data being underpinning all of this, and I couldn't agree more. But poor supplier data is an inhibitor on procurement's oldest and still probably favorite subject, which is how do we reduce spend by category and by suppliers. If you don't know who your suppliers are in a given category, you've got 17 different suppliers, or 17 suppliers with the same or different name, but they're the same. Doing that kind of spend analysis and spend sort of reduction, even though that's not our favorite topic, it is still part of the role. It's a lot harder. So it's hard to specifically say, by fixing data, we will reduce spend by X million. But I think it's pretty obvious that if you don't have that visibility, then realizing those savings is going to be extremely difficult. So I think there are direct efficiency-related savings, and then there are these indirect sort of savings. And I think both of those can go into a hard numbers-based business case, which is in turn supported by this general view that getting preferential treatment from your suppliers, being your customer choice of suppliers, is just good business sense. So yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, again, just kind of reading my mind here, but the customer of choice point was something that I actually wanted to just discuss a bit more as well, because like, have you perhaps, like Anthony, from your viewpoint, heard of any, I guess, well, case studies, just customer examples of how that improved experience with suppliers, well, improved supplier experience has really, well, I guess, increased the customer of choice standing of the buyer? Can we go as far quite yet as to draw that connection there?
You know, nothing would please me more than to say company X has done this and their share price went up by Y. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in the relatively early days of this movement. There are definitely organizations who are actively taking this on and actively addressing it. I've alluded to a couple of things in terms of savings from, you know, even if they're internally driven, you know, like the sharing of payment invoice status may be an internally driven thing because we want to reduce cost in AP. But you can bet suppliers are happy about it, because with that particular company, it's a lot quicker to find out and be more predictable in terms of cash flow than their other 18 customers. So no, I don't think we're there yet, sadly. But I'm excited that we're heading in that direction for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some parallels that can be drawn from this, because some examples of, well, organizations having, for example, reduced the onboarding kind of red tape and just made the overall process a bit easier for, I think, primarily like smaller suppliers, in the startup scene, for example, just maybe from innovation perspective, especially trying to attract the top innovation from those less established companies. So that's something that we've definitely seen from, you know, Procurement Leaders Network perspective as well. But perhaps there's an opportunity when it comes to improving diversity and inclusion, for example, which is obviously a massive topic as well. So if you improve the supplier experience of the smaller suppliers, then it becomes easier to attract those diverse suppliers and achieve your ESG goals then as a result there. Yeah, so just something that kind of came to mind when you walked us through that, Anthony. Carmen, just final question before I move us on to the couple of other questions that have come from the audience. But from that customer of choice perspective, what's your thinking around that? Just more broadly as well at Henkel, not just looking at the supplier experience alone, but like, are you putting concentrated effort on improving your standing as a customer of choice for your suppliers?
I'm not sure if a good supplier experience will be the go, no-go decision point on the supplier side that they do business with Henkel. I'm not sure if we can go that far, but as said also and shared earlier, we are not a charity company. We do that on our end on a very egoistic and for a good reason, because I believe that we can take quicker and faster the right decisions if we have the data available by hand when we need it, up to date. And that is also where the business case comes in for me. That I have, first of all, less people getting me the data, but I have it also quicker and I have it more up to date. Also, if I would tell you how many tickets we currently handle in the collaboration with our suppliers, coming back to measurements, yeah, a clear target would be for me cutting the tickets by 50%. I mean, go bold on that one. If it's really seamless and cool, I mean, how often do you raise tickets with your banks? Me, not so often, because my bank account digitally is quite clear. I know what to do. If I would have the same experience from a supplier, then that is what we should strive for. And is it again that a supplier would say, I go with Henkel because it's easier to work with them than with another company? Maybe there are scenarios at a market where that could be the last point, yes. At a certain point in time, I think Eloise said that once very nicely. She said, at the end, what does supplier want? He wants to simply earn money with you and do more orders with you. And if you have systems and processes in place which do not support that, then you also have a problem. So
yeah, exactly. Maybe it's not a case of, and that's a really good conclusion. I think it's not necessarily a matter of attracting that supplier. It's actually getting the supplier over the finish line and actually start collaborating with them. So very interesting points there. Notice we're drawing dangerously close to the hour, so I just want to get a couple of questions from the audience in here as well before we close, but maybe one to you, Anthony, here. First of all, just some feedback. Great insights on the supplier segmentation and personalization here. The question being that what is your thought on the willingness of companies to invest on technologies to enrich suppliers' digital experience? So yeah, your thoughts on that, Anthony?
Definitely growing. We are seeing some of the leading, organizations that would be widely recognized as leaders in procurement and supply chain. Henkel, unquestionably, but also organizations like Unilever, Mondelez, Mars, I mentioned earlier. So there is an increasing willingness to spend, and there's obviously a recognition that technology is key to this. And so Carmen's answer actually to what matters from a technology perspective. Obviously, she could have written my answer for me: data integration and the third thing, which was automation. So because I wrote them down as she spoke. So there is a role for technology to play. Companies are willing to invest, but I do think we are seeing the leaders start to make this move, and I do see a sense of acceleration. But the ROI question is key, right? People do have to understand how this is going to have an impact, and they are comparing initiatives like this with other projects with perhaps a more easily definable return. And so I think sessions like this hopefully help people to evaluate and start to see supplier experience as a priority.
Thanks for that, Anthony. Maybe just kind of closing us on here. So just to, I guess, allow you some time to just again put a layer of practicality on all of this. I know we've talked about this from theoretical and even philosophical level here, but just really kind of last words of recommendation for the audience here. So maybe Carmen, starting with you, what would be your, I guess, last words of advice for people when it comes to improving supplier experience and really thinking about this challenge of dealing with suppliers from the supplier's perspective?
I believe that a latest trend is that we more bring our personal experience when we do shopping, when we go to platforms. We assume that we have the same experience in a business context. And that is currently super different. So Amazon, like shopping experience, 3 clicks, I get what I want. Then I go to business, thousands of clicks, very complex. I don't think that's state of the art. And at the very end, then people find workarounds and do different things, or at the end do not work with you just because it's not a cool experience. So for me and for our company, that's definitely one of the hot topics moving on. It's on the top of our strategic agenda. And I believe with that one, we are really the first movers, which we definitely want to be when it comes to digitalization of procurement. And I do think we really do lose time, a dramatic step, if we don't go on that one right now. Not only from experience, but I just come back to that one also on data. How do you want to set up a sustainable process and governance model to get the data from your suppliers and to exchange data with your suppliers? And there's, for me, no other way than providing a cool supplier experience and with that coming to the target.
Thanks, Carmen. Same question to you, Anne. One last words of advice.
Yeah, so I think Carmen alluded to just then as me, which is to think about, and I said this before, we have the journey's been followed already with our customer-facing colleagues, right? They think in these terms. I'm not saying the commercial relationship changes. Clearly, we're still the buyer. The supplier is still the supplier. That's not going to change anytime ever. But by looking at how the customer-facing teams work, and by borrowing from them in terms of technology and process and thinking, I think we can deliver a much better supplier experience. I don't think it's as hard as people think, because these tools exist. The technology is all there. And then I think to the person that asked the question, there are hard benefits that will accrue. And we don't need this to be some big, highfalutin, glorious, grandiose project, right? Pick use cases that your suppliers care about, use digital tools to fix them. And as Carmen says, base that on data. And I think there is a clear path forwards here, which, as I've said all along, is why I'm so excited about it. So thank you.
Likewise, yeah, it's a very important topic and obviously something that has been discussed, I guess, indirectly for a while already, but it's really starting to come to fruition now. So good to have companies leading the way here as well, in companies like HICX and Henkel here. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for us here today. So just one kind of reminder here that any feedback that you may have, feel free to submit through the link there, and make sure to check the Procurement Leaders Networking calendar for any upcoming webinars as well. And also, just on a bigger theme here, we have our upcoming America's Procurement Congress in about a month's time in Miami, in US. So if anyone's interested in that, there's more information here on the slide, and you can head over to our website to find out more about that event. But yeah, thanks first of all to Anthony and Carmen for lending your knowledge and expertise here, and for everyone in the audience for taking part. Hopefully this was as useful for you as it was for me. I've definitely learned a lot here today. So thanks again, Anthony and Carmen, and for everyone, and have a great rest of the day wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.